Good morning, friends. Welcome to the YouTube channel GMAT Titans, and I'm your trainer Hitanshu Munjal. In the last lecture, we had discussed about the basic components of a critical reasoning argument. One is the premise and one is the conclusion. So we learned that the conclusion is the author's main claim or the author's main point and the author's opinion. And also we had learned about certain indicator words that indicate what a conclusion could be in the argument. We also learned what premise is, and premise is the evidence on the basis of which the author reaches the conclusion. And basically premise is a set of data or any other kind of information after analyzing which we can reach a conclusion. So today what we are going to do is we are going to solve a sample critical reasoning question, and on the basis of the information discussed in the last lecture. So let's read the sample question. It says mutation breeding is a method of crop development that requires breeders to first find plants that randomly display the traits researchers are looking for and then breed those plants with other plants displaying similar traits. In order to bring about the required mutations, researchers bombard plants with thermal neutrons, X-rays, and known carcinogenic chemicals in order to damage the plant's DNA. Today, almost all varieties of wheat grown commercially are products of mutation breeding. Ironically, when scientists discovered how to splice desirable genes directly into the plants, thus avoiding the use of harmful chemicals and radiation, critics derided the new process as potentially dangerous despite the lack of any supporting evidence, resulting in boycotts and bans on genetically modified food. The argument as a whole is structured to lead to which of the following conclusions? So basically, we have to analyze this information given in the stimulus, and we have to see that what conclusion can be reached after analyzing this argument. So the options read as follows. Genetically modified food may have been unfairly stigmatized by its critics. Mutation breeding produces safer food than does genetic modification. Foods produced by genetic modification are healthier than foods produced by mutation breeding. Researchers should stop using mutation breeding in order to modify foods. Genetic modification of plants is more cost effective than mutation breeding of plants. So, as already discussed, the conclusion is the author's opinion or the author's claim or the main point of the author or what the author is trying to make us believe. So let's read this, try to find out what the author is trying to make us believe. So here one of the indicator words which indicates the author's opinion or claim is the word ironically. So basically the author thinks that it is ironic, or in other words, it is absurd that when scientists discovered how to splice desirable genes directly into the plants, thus avoiding the use of harmful chemicals and radiation, critics derided the new process as potentially dangerous despite the lack of any supporting evidence, resulting in boycotts and bans on genetically modified foods. So here we have an indication that this is what the author thinks. This could be the author's opinion or claim. So we have in the options we have to select an option which matches this opinion. So let us take an option one by one. First option says genetically modified food may have been unfairly stigmatized by its critics. So when we read the author's claim, this looks like a close match, so let's keep it. Next option says mutation breeding produces safer food than does genetic modification. So this is completely the opposite, because there is no such indication that mutation breeding produces safer food. As we have already seen in the stimulus, that it says that researchers bombard plants with thermal neutrons, X-rays, and known carcinogenic chemicals in order to damage the plant's DNA. So obviously there is no indication that mutation breeding is safer, so this option has to be eliminated. Next option says foods produced by genetic modification are healthier than foods produced by mutation breeding. This common sense wise, this seems to be true, but again, in the stimulus, there is no direct indication of the author stating that which food is healthier, which food is not. He's merely stated that one type of food is banned and the other type of food is not. So this option is also eliminated. Next option says researchers should stop using mutation breeding in order to modify foods. He has mentioned that harmful processes are used to produce genetically modified food in the process of mutation breeding, but nowhere he says that mutation breeding should be stopped. So again, this option is eliminated. Next option says, the last option says, genetic modification of plants is more cost effective than mutation breeding of plants. So again, this goes totally out of scope because nowhere in the stimulus there is any mention of cost. So obviously the conclusion is genetically modified food may have been unfairly stigmatized by its critics. So let's read the explanation to it again. Explanation says the conclusion, as you will recall, is the author's opinion or belief. As you read the argument, look for indicators of the author's opinion. The first three sentences of the argument do not state opinions. The author is simply describing the method of mutation breeding. However, in the fourth sentence, the author uses the word ironically. This is an indicator of how the author feels. The author believes it is ironic that genetically modified foods are banned despite any supporting evidence that they are dangerous, while foods created with mutation breeding which use harmful chemicals and radiation account for almost all varieties of wheat. Now we just need to find an answer choice that matches this opinion. Choice A looks pretty close, so let's hang on to it. Choice B is the opposite of what the author argues. The argument implies that genetic modification is safer. Choice C is close, but the argument doesn't really discuss which foods are healthier, just that one type is banned and the other type isn't. Choice D also isn't discussed. The author thinks it's ironic that genetically modified foods are banned but never states that mutation breeding should be stopped. Finally, E doesn't work because the argument doesn't express any opinion about cost effectiveness, thus A is correct. So let's move on to the next sample question. Identify the reasoning type. So let's read the question stimulus. It says a common myth is that animals can sense an impending earthquake, and while most geophysicists dispute this assertion and claim that there is no way to predict an earthquake, a new hypothesis for predicting earthquakes is generating interest in the scientific community. This hypothesis is based on a well-known principle: subjecting rocks to extreme pressures causes the rocks to produce electrical currents. Now, a leading physicist has proposed that this principle may help predict earthquakes. For example, an earthquake along the San Andreas Fault in California could produce hundreds of thousands of amperes, units of electrical current, that would disrupt the ionosphere surrounding the Earth. By monitoring the ionosphere for electrical fluctuations, scientists may be able to predict earthquakes. In the argument above, the two bold-faced statements play which of the following roles? So let's read the option. A says the first statement expresses the conclusion of the argument, while the second statement provides support for that conclusion. The first statement expresses the conclusion of the argument as a whole. The second statement provides a possible consequence of the conclusion. C says the first statement presents support for the conclusion of the argument as a whole. The second statement states the conclusion of the argument. The first statement expresses an intermediary conclusion of the argument, while the second statement presents a possible objection to the intermediary conclusion. Option E says the first statement provides support for a conclusion that the argument opposes. The second statement expresses the conclusion that the argument as a whole opposes. So let's see whether we can find out which role these two bold statements play. So we have statements A, B and D saying that the first statement expresses the conclusion of the argument. So we have to ask ourselves the question that is the first statement that is subjecting rocks to extreme pressures causes the rocks to produce electric currents, is it really the conclusion? When we read this argument, when we read ahead of this statement, first of all, this statement says is a principle, right? It is a scientific principle. It says subjecting rocks to extreme pressures causes the rocks to produce electrical currents. Now, in the further statement, it says, now a leading physicist has proposed that this principle may help predict earthquakes. For example, an earthquake along the San Andreas Fault in California could produce hundreds of thousands of amperes units of electrical current that would disrupt the ionosphere surrounding the Earth. Now here what they are doing is they have made a practical application of this scientific principle. And after seeing the consequence or the result of the practical application of the scientific principle, they have reached the conclusion that by monitoring the ionosphere for electrical fluctuations, scientists may be able to predict earthquakes. So obviously the first statement is not this first statement is not the conclusion. So we have to eliminate all those options which say that first statement is the conclusion. So we eliminate the options A, B and D. So we are left with two options here, C and E, which are C and E. So both say that the first statement is the support for the conclusion of the argument as a whole. Okay. But in E it says that the first statement provides support for a conclusion that the argument opposes. Okay. But here we see this is the core argument here. So here we see that this core argument is merely showing the practical application of this principle, and the consequence of the practical application of this principle is that they reach the conclusion that by monitoring the ionosphere for electrical fluctuations, scientists may be able to predict earthquakes. So here the argument is opposing nothing. So E option is also eliminated, and therefore C is the answer. So now let's read the explanation to this. Explanation says the key to cracking this question is using the Y test. Let's try using the Y test. This is, you can say, an alternative method of solving this critical reasoning question. The key to cracking this question is using the Y test. Let's try using the Y test on the two bold-faced statements and see which one works best. If we make the first statement the conclusion, we would end up with something like this. Conclusion: subjecting rocks to extreme pressures causes the rocks to produce electrical currents. Why? Premise: by monitoring the ionosphere for electrical fluctuations, scientists may be able to predict earthquakes. Does that make sense? No. So let's eliminate any answers that say that the first sentence is the argument's conclusion. That allows us to eliminate A, B and D. Now let's see what happens if we flip the statements around. Conclusion: by monitoring the ionosphere for electrical fluctuations, scientists may be able to predict earthquakes. Why? Premise: subjecting rocks to extreme pressures causes the rocks to produce electrical currents. That makes much more sense. Choice E states that the argument opposes the conclusion, which it doesn't. So we can eliminate that choice. Choice C is the answer. So guys, that's all for today. Thank you for joining, and if you have any doubts, you can leave in the comment section. Thank you so much for joining. Please like and subscribe our channel. Thank you so much.